What's going on, guys? So today we're going to be replacing engine mounts or motor mounts, whatever you want to call it. When I initially bought this car, it did have some excessive drivetrain vibration. It turned out to be a completely shot transmission mount, but replacing the trans mounts didn't fix the issue completely. It still got a little bit of vibration, and me running it at race legal, launching the car hard and shifting it even harder only made the problem worse. Go figure. So today we're going to be replacing the motor mounts. Now I have a set of RevShift 88 poly mounts. These are on the softer side of the polyurethane mounts. I've never run poly mounts before, so I'm kind of interested to see what it's going to be like. A lot of people say they're perfectly dailyable. Others absolutely hate daily driving them. I've never had any experience with poly mounts on my car, so we're going to replace them. Now, whatever mounts you're going to be running, whether they're factory OE rubber mounts or even solid mounts for a track car or polyurethane mounts like I'm going to be running, the install and replacement is exactly the same for all of the mounts. Also, for you guys with M42s and M44s, 4-cylinder cars, the replacement is going to be the exact same. You just have a little bit easier time because you have a smaller motor to work around. This is a 6-cylinder car, so engine mounts are not terribly hard to replace. They're just kind of a pain because they're a little bit finicky. It's a fairly straightforward and simple process, but it can be kind of a trick to line things back up properly. Tools we will be using: a 3/8 driver, a 16mm socket. I also used a 17mm socket. The bottom nuts on the engine mount for my factory mounts was 17, so I did have to use that. That being said, the replacement mounts that I put in used 16 on the bottom, not 17. A 3/8 swivel, that is to basically get the upper nuts off because they're kind of at an angle. A 6-inch 3/8 drive extension, that is for the lower mounts. We got to slide the socket up through the lower control arm to get to those nuts. And a longer extension. This one's about 2.5 feet. This is used to slide down through the engine bay in conjunction with the swivel mount to get the upper nuts off. 2 jack stands. We do need to get the car up in the air to climb under it to access and replace the mount, so we will need those. A jack. We do need to get the car up in the air again, and we need a jack for that. I also used 2 pieces of wood along with the jack to lift the front end of the motor so we can get the weight of the engine off of the jack. You could also use an engine hoist or an engine support brace. Either way, I use the jack. Now, before we get into it, I kind of want to explain what's going on here, simply because engine mounts are kind of buried down in the bay and it's kind of hard to get a good angle of it and sort of get, you know, the whole plan across as to what we're doing while we're doing it. So I figured I'm going to explain it to you guys using Legos because Legos are nice. Just so you guys can sort of get a game plan and understand what we need to do before we start going in. I don't know how well I'm going to explain it or present it while I'm in there working on it, so we're just gonna get the story straight here. So visualize with me here for a second. This black piece on the bottom is the subframe. The green pieces are the engine mounts. The red pieces here are the little aluminum mounts that the engine is bolted to, and the blue piece is the actual engine, right? So if you guys can kind of visualize that. So what you need to do is, for one, get the weight of the engine off the engine mount. So we're going to be using a jack today. Now we're going to unbolt the tops and on the bottoms of the engine mount, and then we're going to jack the engine up. So get that guy off there. Now what I've found for this several times I've done it, the first time I did it, I unbolted both of them and lifted the whole thing up. But the issue with that is that it never comes up straight. Like, it'll come up, but it might like shift to the side or shift forward or whatever, and you're kind of like struggling to get it back into the spot it needs to be when you're putting it back together. So what I like to do is I will loosen this bolt and this bolt, and then take this side, the nuts for these, completely off, and then when we lift the engine, it's actually going to sort of pivot it up like that, sort of use that spot as an anchor. So then we can take this engine mount all the way off, put the new one back on, and then it helps it a little bit easier to align it all back up because it's sort of pivoting off of that other mounts. Now, of course, you're going to have transmission mounts back here that'll sort of also help guide it, but it's still going to be kind of a trick. A couple times I've done this, the motor has dropped like straight back onto the engine mount, no problem. Some other times it'll sort of still be off a little bit, so you sort of have to, you know, jimmy with it and mess with it to get it aligned properly. But once that side is on, we'll stick the nut up top here and the nut on the bottom, and then we'll sort of pivot off of that mount for the other side, pull that mount off, put the new mount on, and sort of drop it back down again. So you absolutely could unbolt both all the way and then just lift the motor straight up like that, but I found that's kind of a trickier way to do it. Either way, the engine might try and fight you coming back on. So you're just gonna have to sort of slowly lower it and work it into the position that you need it to be, and then bolt it all together, and then it'll be good. Now another thing to note before we get in it, it does have a proper orientation. Now if you can see that little section of the subframe right there, that's where the engine mounts will sit. And if you notice, there's two holes. Now on the bottom of the mount you have the main thread, but you also have a little dowel pin. So that dowel pin needs to line up in his little hole properly for this thing to be sitting on correctly. So once you get the dowel pin on, it's not really going to want to rotate around because that dowel pin's holding it in place. Just know you do need to get that dowel pin lined up, otherwise the engine mount will not be sitting on properly. And that's for both sides too. Now as far as accessing the engine bolts from up top, if you guys look right there, that's one of them. So that little nut is the engine mount nut on the exhaust side. And I have a 16mm on a little swivel on a longer extension. This guy is fairly straightforward to get to. If you just drop him down, you can hook him on just like that and use a wrench from up here. Now the other one's a little bit more trick to get to. If you look between the power steering res and this coolant hose down here, he's literally right between them. It's going to be kind of hard to get him on camera. But as far as hooking him goes, I've found if you go behind here, go through the idle control hose. So if you guys look at this boot back there, that hose right there is for the idle control valve. If you go between it, past this coolant hose, you can hook them on there. Now it's going to be kind of hard for you guys to see this on camera because the lighting down there is really bad, but that's on there. So I can take that nut off just like that. So just a tip for you guys, you will need a long extension to do this way, but that's the way that I like to get them off. It's the easiest way to hook them. Now one of the more difficult aspects of replacing the engine mounts is simply the fact that we need to get the weight of the motor off of the engine mounts. And this requires basically lifting the engine. Now there's a couple ways you could do this. One of them is an engine support. So this guy is basically just going to hang on the fenders and then you can jack up the motor from that. You could also use an engine hoist. If you take the engine hoist and grab onto the engine lift right by the Svanos unit here, you can jack the whole motor up using that. Now I do have access to an engine hoist and I could use one, but I figure most of, if not a majority of you guys probably don't have an engine lift at home, and more than likely you guys are going to have a jack, just a normal car jack. So I'm going to be using that today in conjunction with a piece of wood here and jack it up by the oil pan. I'll show you guys how to do that later on just to get the weight of the engine off. Now, majority of the work is going to be done underneath the car, so we do need to get this thing up in the air. I'm just going to be lifting the front and putting it on jack stands. I will leave a video link in the description for you guys to jack up your car if you don't know how to do that. Now once the car is up in the air, we are going to crack the top engine mounts first, the top nuts on them. I'm going to crack both of them. We are going to be doing the left side of the car first, so I'm going to be taking both the top and the bottom nuts all of the way off. The right side of the car, I'm going to crack them loose and undo them until they're like at the top of their threads, but they're not going to be all the way out. This way, when I jack up the engine, the mount is still going to be in its place, so we can sort of use that to pivot. There we go. That side I'm just going to loosen. Now underneath the car, that is the exhaust manifold right there. That is our engine mount and the nut is right there. So we're going to have to go through that hole to get that nut. And same thing goes for that side. So that is the lower control arm. We're going to go through that hole right there to get up through at that engine mount. And I'm going to be taking that nut all the way off and just loosening the one on the right side. Also, do keep in mind at this point the weight of the engine is still on those engine mounts, so you don't really have to be worried about the motor just like falling out or whatever just because you're taking those nuts off right now. Also note, I'm using a 6-inch extension and the nuts on these are 17 for some reason. I thought they were 16, but they're 17. Alright, so now we have to jack up the motor. So here's the front sway bar, here's the steering rack. Mine's leaking E36 life. And so we're going to take our block of wood here and we're going to put it right like that on the oil pan. So I'm going to put mine like that. I'm going to stack a couple more blocks of wood, and then we're just going to jack it up from that point right there. And that'll lift the whole front of the motor up that way. Now another thing to keep in mind is we do need to jack it high enough to get the engine mount off. So if you're jacking yours up and you can't get your engine mount off, you do need to jack it up a little bit more. Now a few things to note while you're jacking up the motor. Make sure that you're not on any of the power steering lines or the sway bar or anything else besides the motor itself. You don't want to put that much force on something like a power steering line because you might break it. Another thing to note while you're jacking up the motor, be careful and watch what's going on, because if you pull on a wire, if you got something snagged and it's getting yanked, you're more than likely going to rip it apart because there's just a lot of force and a lot of weight going against this motor. Now because we still have threads and nuts on that side, you'll notice when I jack it up, the engine's not going to go straight up. It's going to kind of pivot at an angle like that. Alright, so I think I've gotten the motor high enough to where I'm able to take that motor mount out. Now I'm going to try and extract it. Oh, it's out, but it doesn't fit. First problem of the day. Oh, it's like a puzzle. Oh, there it is. Alright. Alright, so I've got my new mount. I've got my hardware off. Oh, that one fits a lot nicer. And so now I'm going to put this thread in its hole and line that dowel pin up. And I'm going to thread the bottom nut on. Just finger tight for now. I'm going to leave it a little loose so this mount has room to sort of move around as we lower the mount on. Alright, so here's where it gets a little tricky because I need to line that guy up and I've almost got it. Now with this hand, I have the jack handle that I'm going to be slowly unscrewing, and I'm going to sort of be guiding it into place with my other hand. It's almost in. And that's why I sort of left this mount a little bit loose, so I have some room to sort of adjust it. Ooh, that's money, baby. We're lined up on the dowel pin. Ooh, we are. Now I'm going to reach up and try and get that nut started. There we are. So I've got that one threaded. I'm going to tighten that guy all the way. Just finger tight for now. Now I'm going to leave the top one loose so that one has a little bit of room to sort of move around as we do the other side, but I'm going to tighten this one down all the way just by hand right now because I don't want it to pop out of its little dowel pin spot, because that would be a pain and then we have to rotate the whole thing back around. Just to prevent that, we're going to leave this one just finger tight for now so it'll hold that dowel pin in place. So now we're going to go do the same thing to the other side. We got to get the bottom nut and the top nut all the way off, and then we're going to basically repeat the same procedure, jack it up, and then get the new mount lined up. Unthread him all the way. There we go. Now this one's going to be a little fun because my 17 socket got stuck on the bottom mount bolt. So I'm going to jack it up, and as I'm jacking it up, I'm going to take that nut off too, and then jack it up even more to get the rest of the mount off. My socket back. You thief. There we go. That one came out a lot easier. Now one thing to note is that the exhaust side has this little heat shield here, and so that guy is going to sort of sit on the mount like that to protect it from the exhaust. So I'm going to be reusing this. It looks like this little dowel thing is broken off on this one or got bent. So here's the other one. This is off my other M3, and you've noticed it has like this little dowel pin right there that'll line it up on these holes on the engine mount. Now, yeah, sort of sit like that. Now on this mount, this new poly mount does not have a little spot for that, which is perfect because this one doesn't have that little pin there. But if you do, and I highly recommend you do run these again, if you've got a mount that doesn't have a spot like that, you can just sort of break it off, and then that guy will just sort of sit on like that. Alright, so again we're going to be lining up a little dowel pin. I'm going to thread the lower one on just about all the way. Still has a little bit of movement. Easy. There we go. That lined up nicely. Oh, fuck, I didn't put the heat shield on. God damn it. Right. Now we slide our heat shield on. There we go. Now I'm going to thread the top nut on. Alright, so once we have all of the nuts on, top and bottom, and the dowel pins lined up, I'm going to take this all the way out. So now the torque spec for these guys is between 192 inch-pounds and 400 inch-pounds, depending on what grade of nuts we're using. I'm not super worried about torquing these. I'm just going to get them freaking tight. Because the top ones are kind of at an angle, it's going to be hard to get a proper torque rating from that. Alright, now the last step is to get the car off the jack stands. Alright, our engine mounts are replaced. Thank you guys so much for watching. Keep it fresh, and I will see you guys later.
We are dreaming in the dark. We are nothing more than dust.